can't wait to do a nasty unionist edit of this. And we're live. I'm joined by Random Scottish History to talk about, shocker, Scottish history. Well, mostly Scottish history, some modern stuff. Do you find that surprising?
Not really.
Okay, that's good. So I've got a range of topics with you to discuss. Sort of like Scotland's place within the Union.
Mm-hmm.
I can bring up the questions on the main screen, actually. You've already got these in front of you.
You sent me them, but it's all stuff that I've gone over a lot before.
Yeah, I can imagine. Should minimise this. So yeah, just a load of topics to talk about how Scotland became part of the Union, the nature of how kind of representations changed, kind of I guess the history of it, and then coming towards like the modern era. I know the modern era is not really your thing. It's in your name, but like I think it's probably worth discussing.
I mean, yeah, when it comes to the Macron report and Scottish devolution, I mean that's fine. It's all part and parcel of the same thing, isn't it?
I'm not sure why Macron would write a report on Scottish anything, but sure.
The Macron report was very important, but it was hushed by Westminster because it showed Scotland to be too positive and too wealthy.
Okay. Well, let's start with how did Scotland join the British Union then?
There's always been contention between Scotland and England. We're aware of that. We were having wars with each other all the time, especially from the end of the 13th century with your Bruce and Wallace and all that, your wars of independence, when the English Eddie the First felt like Scotland was part of his dominion. So it had got to a point at the end of the 17th century when tensions were super high. There'd been an English captain, Captain Green, I think, was executed by Scots. He was an English captain and the English were mad about that. But he was executed on the belief that he had murdered a Scottish sailing vessel and its fleet, So they were readying themselves for another war. But they felt like the Union would be the way to prevent that from happening, because they'd already petitioned Queen Anne to secure all the forts at the border, your Newcastle and Carlisle and all that. But there were a series of acts that were kind of revenge acts against each other. England would enact one, Scotland would do a reciprocal act in return. And this series ended with the English Alien Act, which meant that any Scots in England were to be deemed foreign, which is fine, but if they had any English family that died, they weren't able to inherit. No goods from Scotland were to be imported into England, the same from England into Scotland, with an especial focus on horses and armaments, because they didn't want Scotland to be armed for whatever was coming. And the Alien Act, that happened in 1704, 3 years before the Union was ratified. And the English basically said, if you enter negotiations with us in order to join a union with us, then we'll scrap the Alien Act. And Scots went, scrap the Alien Act and we'll enter negotiations. And so that's how that happened.
Okay.
But people weren't happy about it. The Scots wanted a federal union. So a federal union is what Home Rule would be. They wanted a Scottish Parliament to remain. They wanted the English Parliament to remain, and they wanted an imperial parliament in the north of England between the two that would deal with any affairs that were on behalf of both countries, but also international trade as well. But the Scots did not get that form of union because the English didn't want that form of union. They wanted to be able to have as much control over Scotland as possible out of the Union.
Why didn't Scotland just leave at that point then?
Because it wasn't like how we would have a referendum or a vote now. The general population that were up in arms against this really didn't have a say. It was those in authority, it was your lords and your dukes and people, landed folk, wealthy folk, that had a say in these things. And Charles Waddy has very kindly provided us with a list of everyone that was bribed by the English Parliament with the help of the English monarchy, which was the British monarchy at that time, but they were very much focused on behalf of the English. They were very indifferent to the Scots.
This sounds like very underhanded tactics. I would not associate with that kind of stuff with the British monarchy.
You wouldn't? Really? Okay.
Really being played on thick there.
Yeah.
Do you think that's why Scotland, instead of being kind of colonised by conflict, was done by a treaty, because it would be a really hard conflict for either side to win? Do you think that's...
Yeah.
Because obviously Ireland, Britain went in there kind of really heavy-handed and decided to, take over by force. Do you think that's why Scotland was different? Because I think even the Romans had problems with Scotland, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, people say that the Romans never made it past southern Scotland. The Romans made it over the extent of Britain. The Romans made it very far into Scotland, but they very quickly decided it wasn't worth their while because we gave them a lot of hassle in return for it. So they kind of backtracked a wee bit. But I think both the authorities on both sides at the time of the Union, they wanted the Union. They did. They wanted an end to the constant wars and the constant threat of war. They did want to find a solution to that, and the solution was the Union. Scots tried very hard to get exactly what they were expecting to get from the Union. They wanted equality. It was said that in entering the Union, England was no more united to Scotland than Scotland was to England. We were united on equal footing, what Scotland was to get, England was to get, etc. It never worked out that way, but it's because the acts, the way they were worded in the Treaty of Union, gave a lot of unfortunate leeway that the Scots hadn't foreseen. So a lot of the articles will say something along the lines of, this article cannot be changed unless for the benefit of the Scottish people. But once it was ratified and we're in Parliament, we've got 45 MPs to 500 odd English MPs. So the people that were ultimately deciding what was to the benefit of Scots was your English faction within Westminster. So they just started changing the treaty, technically, and like usurping on various parts of the treaty to get as much as they could from Scots, to the point where a mere 6 years after the Union was ratified, Seafield and Findlater, two of the lords that signed off on the Union, took it to the House of Lords for a debate on Scotland leaving the Union. They had already had enough. They saw how the ground was laid. They saw what the future held for Scotland if we stayed in the Union, that we were just going to be taken for everything we had. And they had a vote in the House of Lords on Scotland's place in the Union, and we were 4 votes away from having it ended at that point. So, close call.
Do you think that the lords and the nobles in Scotland maybe were divided as well? Maybe that's the reason why they didn't rebel, because you spoke about bribery earlier.
It came down to allegiances.
Oh, I see.
It was just down to allegiances. There's going to have been ties made within that first 6 years, where English lords and authority were promising various to keep the Scottish lords and authority sweet, because they were infringing on some of the law, especially when it came to taxation. Suddenly Scots found themselves overly taxed. I mean, we took on half of England's £2 million debt on the signing of the Union. So taxation just went through. But then they started trying to find other things to tax that was denied to them by the treaty, but then they went, no, but it's for the Scots' benefit, because if we tax them, then we've got that money to spend on Scotland, which they didn't. They just started. So, yeah, Scotland from the get-go was the most overtaxed, underfunded and underrepresented part of the Union, which was only really highlighted once Ireland joined in 1801.
So you might be worth just going into detail about that, Ben. When Ireland, I wouldn't say joined, I'd say forced into it, would be more the case for Ireland, I think.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the Irish have always been fiercely independent and didn't want any encroachment of the Anglo-centralisation that Scotland saw. But they actually, in fact, got a better deal out of their union than Scotland did, starting with the fact that £20 million of English debt, Ireland wasn't party to that debt. So they also ended up getting their institutions better funded, their universities, their arts, etc. were all better funded than Scots. They were less taxed than Scots, and they were granted a better representation than Scots as well. But again, these are things that were given to them to keep, because it was so contentious with the Irish. They almost had to give them a slightly better deal. That
is surprising, because you would think, kind of, with the way I think Britain treated Ireland as more of a colony, you would think it would be a lot more brutal than that, if that makes sense. And obviously there would have been kind of British repression in Ireland, but for them to give kind of more concessions than they gave to Scotland is a bit odd.
Again, it came down to the authorities, and if you think that for longer than it had been so obvious in Scotland, I mean, it had been happening in Scotland too, but it was less obvious, the planting of non-Irish into Ireland, and the fact that so many of the lords, the nobles over there, their authorities, were Protestant, quite a lot were English plants, or not ancestors, but descendants of English planting families,
Right.
So they already had an in, because technically their own people were already there. But
right.
I mean, that led to obviously your famine, and that was a human made failure.
So I guess it'd be English lords kind of taxing other English lords less. It's just these ones were based in Ireland rather than in England.
Yeah, they also knew that the people in Ireland, they'd made it so that there wasn't funds available from the people in Ireland. The people were really oppressed, but that was quite a lot to do with the whole sectarian aspect of the fact that the Protestants were in charge, whereas a huge percentage of the general population were Catholic at the time in Ireland.
Right. So the taxation would be less on kind of the English lords in Ireland rather than just the Irish population in general, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, the Irish population, they weren't allowed to be hired, they weren't allowed to, they were second-class citizens in their own country purely because of their religion. Like, Ireland is a very different case than Scotland is.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I guess it would be English lords trying to treat other English lords well, rather than Scotland where you had Scottish lords and nobles.
Yeah, Scotland adopted and was very happy to embrace the Presbyterian Protestant veneer after the Reformation. So we were less kind of got at for religion. We were on side in that way with the English.
Right, so I guess that does bring us kind of onto representation a little bit, because you mentioned earlier, like, Scotland didn't have the representation that it wanted originally, and that Scotland had, I think, around 1/3 of the population England did, but it had much less MPs.
That's right. So it was Article 22 of the Treaty of Union was about Scottish representation at the House of Lords, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. In the House of Lords, there was only 16 Scottish peers allowed to join the House of Lords. But in the House of Commons, 30 was the proposed number of MPs. to join the House of Commons with the 513 English MPs.
So when you mention like they're making changes to the treaties and stuff, they can do that because one act of Parliament undoes another, right?
Well, that was before it was ratified. This Article 22 became contentious. The Scots refused to ratify the Treaty of Union until that was dealt with. They were like, we're not signing off on this if we're only getting 30. And after a lot of negotiations and back and forth, we got 45 MPs, which Scots were like, do you know what? If that's all we can get, then do you know what? Let's run with it. Let's see how we can maybe change things.
And obviously that's way less than a third, right? That was, you would think Scotland would have gotten. Yeah, a lot less than a third. It's less than 10 times like the number of MPs that the English had. Are you surprised they accepted such a low number then in the end? Because obviously that's
I think Scotland felt pushed into it. I honestly felt Scotland was pushed into it, but also the fact that the Duke of Hamilton was supposed to speak on behalf of Scots and get us the best deal possible, but he ended up being a turncoat. He was making out to the Scots that this was the path that he was on. He wanted to help, he wanted to get us, but he was a snake in the grass. Like on the day when he was supposed to do his bit and get up and make sure that we got the representation that we were after, and varying other little amendments that the Scots wanted to see in the Treaty of Union, he bowed out. He was like, I'm not coming, I've got toothache. And they dragged him, and he sat there going, so who's going to do this? I'll second whoever you choose. And they're like, you're going to do that? The plan has always been that you accepted this role. And he went, nah, I'm not up for it anymore. And us. Like, so
my kind of geezer, you know. He said, like, oh yeah, I'll do it, guys.
And then negotiation.
Something, he's like, me? Who, me? No, I'm not doing that. Who come up with this?
Yeah, he made out like he was the main man. He was the man that could get Scotland the best of terms from this treaty. And then when it came to crunch, he went, I don't know, I can be bothered actually. Like, and
is it got Douglas Ross vibes? Is that what I'm hearing?
Oh, worse than Douglas Ross. The Duke of Hamilton is the worst of people. He was really awful. Like,
worse than Douglas Ross. That's crazy. He
f***ed Scotland. He f***ed negotiations from our side, like, completely.
Oh, so this guy, he really did a bad job then. He sabotaged it.
Yeah.
And so the best you got was 45 out of what, like 500 odd? MPs, I think it was.
We got 45, yeah. I think the English had about 513.
So when it comes to, like...
I mean, they're going to have known, the lords that were reading over the street are going to have known that with 45 against 500 odds, how do we get anything passed for Scotland? We have to... I think they were more optimistic than history should have taught them they should have been. I think they felt like maybe we could be friends off the back of this union, that maybe England and the English MPs would vote for what was of benefit to Scotland. But they either didn't turn up to the votes at all, or they flat out voted against things. And again, Charles Waddy gives us a list of varying debates, solely Scottish debates in the House of Commons, and it's a list of all of these very nothing vote, just really basic amenities people are asking for, nothing huge. They're not asking for like large amounts of money to be spent or anything, and they're just getting voted out constantly by the English faction. When the Scots were voting for the thing, the English were just like, knock that away, just that, like we're not allowing this.
Or anything like that.
Yeah,
so it's just a numbers game.
It was almost out of spite in some cases, because a lot of them wouldn't have affected the English budget or anything. Like, it wouldn't have changed really anything. It would have just benefited maybe a region of Scotland just a little bit, and the English were just like, nah, f*** those guys.
No, you know your place kind of votes.
Yeah, it was just out of spite or something, you know. Like, it was really weird to read down this list and go, why would they even vote against that? It must have been just because they're just like, they're Scottish.
Do you have any kind of examples of that? Like anything specific they would have voted against? It does sound kind of funny, like in the sense of they're just like, nah, we're not doing that.
Let's have a wee look at my book here, shall we? We have Charles Waddy's book because I republished it. We've got the first vote that he lists here is that county councils should have control of police.
Is that just in Scotland?
Yeah, just in Scotland. And Scottish votes were 43 for, and we were defeated by 102 votes against by the English.
Who controlled the police before that then? Who would have controlled the police in Scotland at that point?
It would have
the county councils.
It would have been Westminster. I think it would have been a governmental oversight.
So
the
this is kind of a devolved thing they would have wanted.
Yeah, initially it would have been Holyrood that took care of that in Scotland and made sure that the boroughs were policed. And when that went to Westminster, they didn't care. But in saying that, they did vote for a lot of money to be put towards the Irish police because those people needed to be kept down.
That makes sense. So, I can see. I can see why.
Yeah, it wasn't for the protection of the Irish people. It was to police the Irish people.
I think one of the things Thatcher did was give pay rises to police in London because if it pops off, which it did, you need the police on side.
Yeah, exactly.
So, that one makes sense.
Exactly, but you had examples that was happening all the time. The disparity of pay throughout Britain was very different. So a really excellent article, kind of messed up to read it, to be honest. So they're talking about a first-class harbour in Scotland and the employees of this harbour and the fact that they got paid half, 2/3 of what the English counterparts at a second-class harbour in England would get paid. So they've put together this petition outlining the differences and why are there differences? Are we not legislated the same? Why are we getting paid less than a second class staff down in England would get paid? And the return was, how dare you petition us for more money? How dare you? And the petitioners from that harbour were reprimanded for even coming up with a petition in the first place.
You can't ask for a pay rise in any area. It causes inflation and stuff.
They weren't even necessarily asking for a pay rise. They were asking for pay equality. They're like, if I worked just 500 miles down the road, I would get paid double what I'm getting paid at the moment. Why? They were just questioning it. Just what? And they all got severely reprimanded for having dared question such a thing.
So what would be the difference in the first class and second class harbour view?
It would be the type of vessels that they were able to accept and maintain.
You're talking about a skill difference as well then, if you're talking about potentially bigger, more complex ships going through.
Sure, yeah, there'd be a lot more work with some of the larger trading vessels and things, yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I care about in that area is pirates, so I wouldn't know too much about ships. But they do look like a lot of hassle to maintain, to be honest.
Well, there was a French pirate called Thoreau that displaced about 1 million people from the coast of Scotland because Scots were denied arms to protect themselves by Westminster. That was the Act of Prescription in 1746, 1747. We weren't allowed to wear Scottish clothes. It says Highland garb, but it literally meant any article of Scottish clothing, so it didn't even have to be tartan. And people often only had maybe 5 changes of clothes,
Right.
So people couldn't afford to just buy a brand new wardrobe, So you ended up getting imprisoned for 3 years, I think, for a first offence, and then transported for 7 years for a second offence. You were sent off to a British plantation to go and work for 7 years for having dared wear your own clothing.
One hell of a punishment, that is.
Yeah, but they weren't allowed to arm themselves. So at a time when worldwide people were armed and ready to protect what was theirs, England went, nah, actually Scotland, you're exempt. And it's not as if England said, if you're under attack, we'll come to the rescue. It was just, you're not allowed to protect yourselves with arms. The only way that the men could bypass that was by joining the British Army, which proved to be quite the enlistment tactic from Westminster for the British Army, because you join the army, you're able to wear kilts again, you're able to bear arms again. Unfortunately, you're not able to protect your country because you're immediately wheeled off to Crimea or somewhere that England was already fighting folk.
Yeah,
you know.
Plus you have to swear allegiance to the monarch as well.
You did, yes.
A chance of you using your weapons for nefarious tactics. It must have been a parent stream Scotland then. No guards, free real estate.
Yeah, at this point you had English coming up and kidnapping Scots. There was a huge epidemic of Scots being kidnapped and just dragged out as slaves to plantations. So not transported, not legally brought out. It wasn't punishment. They were literally just kidnapped as slaves and sent off to work plantations.
And it was the home of Oliver Cromwell, who defeated the Scots at Dunbar, incorporated Scotland into his protectorate, and transported the Scots as slaves to the colonies. Now, there's an answer to the West Lothian question.
I guess, yeah, you can see that, especially with plantation being a punishment for wearing Scottish clothing.
Yeah.
I guess that, they're them being taken as slaves, like no one's going to question that. So that I can see. So in terms of representation, kind of Scotland, I remember you saying when we spoke about it, like they couldn't figure out how Scotland's MPs were calculated, like the number. So it wasn't based on population or anything like that. It was just a small number picked out, right?
Yes. So a lot of the best arguments against the Union come from very pro-Union Scottish nationalists that formed the Home Rule associations at about the mid-19th century. Because what they were basically saying was, the Union has failed us in this regard over and over again. We keep requesting this thing from Westminster that's constantly denied, and we don't understand it. But what we're realising is that the lack of representation is to blame for the majority of this. The fact that we don't have the votes in Parliament to be able to enact legislation for ourselves, that it always comes down to the whims of the English side, whether or not we get a thing or not. So we constantly don't, because the English are like, oh, we don't care about you, why would we care? So what they realised was that from the time of the signing of the Union, whether you took it by population of either country or by revenue from either country, Scotland in all cases was owed a good 5 times the amount of the MPs that we had. They worked it out that really we should have had 170 MPs to begin with on the signing of the Union, based on population at that time, because Scotland had about 2 million, whereas England at that point only had about 6 million. So we should have had a third of the representation having a third of the population. That wasn't the case, of course.
So Home Rule was the thing I think some Irish people wanted before they, in the end, decided to go for fight for Irish independence. Do you think Home Rule would make a big difference to Scotland? But do you think there are any reasons why kind of Ireland went in a different direction to Scotland, if that makes sense?
It didn't go in a different direction. So Scots wanted Home Rule from the get-go. That's the federal union that I was talking about, that Scots wanted in the first place. Scots always wanted Home Rule. That's what a federal union is. It's like if you look at the United States of America, every state is able to enact for itself. Every state has different laws and a different way of going about a thing. And that would be how Britain would be formed. Scotland would be able to deal with everything solely Scottish for Holyrood, as well as that's what the Irish wanted as well. They're like, if we're going to enter into a union with you, we also want a federal union, but because England had already secured the union it had, almost an incorporating union with Scotland, they were like, listen, this is union we're offering you. Obviously, it didn't take very long for Ireland to be able to secure their home rule. It took about a century for Ireland to obtain the whole home rule it was looking for. Scots were looking for it at the same time. They had really built up a huge case for home rule off the back of how the union had failed for the 150 years that had come before. But they knew that for both to secure home rule, it would have to be granted to both at the same time. That the Scots needed the Irish votes to be able to secure it for itself. And they knew that, they said to Gladstone and that in Palmerston, they were like, if you give Ireland the home rule first, like, we're not going to have the votes. They knew how it was going to go. So when they see Ireland getting home rule before that, they knew that it was done. And then you had the World Wars that just ended everything. The World Wars ended all the talk for a home rule for Scotland. It almost wiped Scots' memories of the fact that the majority of the population, the vast majority of the Scottish population up to that point, had been pro-unionist Scottish nationalists. They were pro-union on the basis that it was of benefit in some way to Scotland, and it just wasn't, which is why the home rule, because they couldn't countenance the idea of leaving the union. They didn't want to abandon the union. They just wanted the union to work for everybody, and it wasn't, you know.
That makes sense.
But the World Wars, that huge propaganda of we are one country, we're in this together, that scuppered everything. Like, so that's why the unionists of today in Scotland are a very different breed. You have to almost be prepared to denounce Scotland and make out like it can't survive without the union in order to be a unionist. You can't be pro-Scotland and pro-Scottish Union these days. That's like two views that are anathema to each other. Indie Truck Dave and I had an argument prior to the first Sunday roast we did, because he didn't believe that such people existed. I'm like, I can prove that they existed for 200 years. Let me show you the ways. And I sent him a few of the books that I'd published, and he was like, right, okay, and he kind of understood that. But the reason that it's so different now as well, that the Scottish nationalists are not pro-unionists, is that it just kept failing. And then the Home Rule bid, the one thing that could have actually saved the Union and made it so that this wasn't even a topic of conversation just now, we failed in that. And so the Scottish nationalists of today are like, we've literally tried everything. We've tried everything with you guys. And yous have shot us down, yous have laughed at us, yous have turned deaf ears to us, and we're just done with it. We're just pure done with it. We're set on doing the thing ourselves now, because you've been so unrelenting in your kind of wee detracting ways that there's just, you've burned your bridges, you know. Much like a longer version of Brexit. You know, like how the EU's not really going to want to entertain Westminster. Scots are at that point with Westminster when it comes to self-determination. You know,
I guess it makes sense. Like, people wanted a lot more autonomy, but stay within the union, and the union said no. So that point, what can you do? That
is the one thing that would have saved the union. We might be all sat out here in Scotland just now as pro-unionist Scottish nationalists that are just proud of our country. And what it's capable of, while appreciating any help that we get from the British Imperial Parliament, you know, whereas
that's an alt universe I don't think anyone's ready for.
Well, we've spent 315 years having the English decide our matters for us. Devolution, I think, was a sticking plaster that Westminster thought that'll knock all this nonsense out of them, because the self-determination movement in Scotland only really started getting going again in the 60s, because again the World Wars nixed it. So there was a whole period between, say, 1920 and the 1960s where it wasn't even really talked about. People were still kind of recovering, still trying to work out how the land lay after the World Wars, I think. Right. And I think Westminster thought, we're going to get people to stop talking about this, the idea of separation, by giving them an inch in terms of devolution. So devolution was basically what they were touting as Devo Max during the referendum. Devolution was, we'll give you a parliament, but we're only going to give you the abilities that we want you to have over Scotland. You're not going to have a say over everything purely Scottish. We're going to tell you which bits you get to work with.
There was obviously someone asking the question about the Scotland Act. That's kind of what we're talking about here, right, in terms of devolution.
Yeah.
Like there are certain powers given, like taxation. Obviously, these powers can be revoked
at
any point
exactly,
by Westminster. And I think Tory MPs have mentioned it to take back the powers.
But some of them are demanding that devolution is scrapped. Yeah, absolutely. So because why would Scots have any say over themselves at all?
I guess that kind of in terms of the economic side of it, that's something we can discuss. But I think I agree with you to an extent. It was a sticking plaster, but I think given the differences between how, especially the Tory government that we have now, compared to what's going on in Scotland, it is very different in terms of certain policies. Like
whenever the Tories have been in, it's been very weird for the Scots, because we've never voted the Tories in. Like, not since the 50s has Scotland voted the Tories in. And even New Labour were really just Tory light. And I don't feel like yous are going to get much of a difference if Starmer's voted in either. Like,
you can say yous, but so long as you're part of the union, it's you as well. You got to leave.
Yeah, we're not really seeing it in that way, though. Despite the fact that a lot of Scots don't understand that the Scottish Parliament is a branch office, a lot of folk that are on side with Scotland regaining self-determination feel like the Scottish Parliament has the rights to just make that happen, and why are they not making it happen, and what's wrong with it? They don't have the right to make that happen. They're a branch office of Westminster.
It's a subsidiary. It's a subsidiary of the Westminster government.
Yeah, and I think a lot of Scots get quite impatient because they don't realise that that's the case.
Well, to be fair, I think we could have mentioned it later, but it's probably worth saying now. Then, in terms of like how Scotland votes, you've got the SNP who have been elected for a while now.
Yeah, since the referendum.
Which definitely shows intent for independence.
Yeah.
But why haven't they been able to get another referendum? Obviously, there was one in, let's say it was 2014.
Yeah.
I think it was narrowly lost, wasn't it? It wasn't that big a margin.
No, it was 45-55 split on it. Not super different from the Brexit vote, to be honest.
Brexit was a bit closer.
Yeah. But I think had the SNP leader at the time, that Salmond fella, had he held off on his vote, I think he was too overconfident. Okay, they had been given the right by Westminster to have the referendum. I don't believe that Westminster set out the timescale for that. I don't think they said, you have to have this vote in 2014. I've not read anything to suggest that was the case. And at the time that the Scottish referendum was even just being talked about, people were having the debates, Sturgeon's having debates on the lead up to the referendum itself. she was having to constantly counter the Better Together side, the no faction side, who kept convincing people to vote no by saying, if you vote no, you're going to immediately no longer be a member of the European Union. And Nicola Sturgeon in 2013, in January of 2013, like a year and a half before the referendum even took place, is on stage saying, you guys are considering having a vote on our place in the European Union.
Yeah.
So you can't tell us that a no vote is going to guarantee our stay in the Union. You guys are about to vote on this. So if Salmond had not decided to have the referendum in 2014, if he'd waited until 2017 or 2018 to have that vote after the Brexit vote was known, how do we think the referendum for Scottish self-determination would have turned out, having been taken out the EU against our will, and that being the main argument for the no vote in 2014?
I think
he was too overconfident.
Yeah, I think it was, and I think the Better Together campaign put enough doubt in kind of enough people's minds where it wasn't clear what kind of Scotland would look like, if it would be better off, if that makes sense. Yeah,
I think the main driver really was the idea that we could lose our EU membership. Yeah. People were freaked out that might be the case. That was such a huge talking point in the run-up to our referendum, because the EU proved itself to be beneficial to Scotland. It proved itself to be beneficial to England and Wales and Ireland, which is how we know that Brexit has failed, is because it was a bad idea leaving all those benefits, you know.
I think the other thing was, I think the Scottish Government talked up the oil revenue, and I think there was a price drop in oil prior to the referendum as well, like fairly close-ish.
I don't know if you've noticed, but whenever the Scots start talking about regaining self-determination, it's very strange that the oil prices suddenly drop.
You guys should keep doing it.
Very coincidental, you know.
It costs a lot, though, so you guys should keep doing it.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of that, in terms of devolution, I guess, I think it has kind of shown how different things can be. Yeah. In terms of, I think you have some areas of nationalised rail. It's way cheaper to get train travel, I think, up there, and it
cheap.
Run better.
Yeah, we at the moment, for example, it's off-peak rates all day, every day, because they're trialling a thing just now. So, yeah.
They do have some subsidies for buses where I am, which is actually beneficial to me. But in terms of, like, for the most part, it is quite expensive to get around down here, and it's not reliable. And obviously there's the train strikes as well, which is not great at the moment. We've had obviously the nurses strike, the nurse and junior doctor strikes down here. I don't think that happened in Scotland because the Hollywood government have tried to negotiate with the healthcare workers, right?
Yeah, I mean, I work for the NHS, and I'm a member of the Royal College of Nursing. That's my union, and they put out feelers to see whether we wanted to strike for better pay, but the Scottish Government kind of got in there, like, pretty quickly, to be honest. They didn't hang back and just wait to see what happened. They seem to have gotten there quite quickly, so I think we voted like 60-70% not to strike. In the end, that was December before last.
The best way to avoid that is obviously negotiations, but the British government the Westminster government has decided not to do that.
They don't even want to sit down for talks.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
And I guess when we list off the other changes, like you've got cleaner water up there because you don't have the privatisation we have down here.
Yeah, it's
you have
publicly
free
owned.
Prescriptions, the high spending per capita on education as well.
And on the NHS, we get far higher spending on NHS, which is why so many of the English doctors end up here with us.
Yeah.
I mean, where I work, there's so many English nurses that I work in a nurse-led organisation, NHS 24, and there's so many English nurses that I work with, and members of staff and admin and things that I don't know that they came up here because of the wage, but it's a surprising amount that we've stolen from you, so to speak.
Stolen. That's me.
Enticed.
Anyway, I guess the real question is, could all of this be done without the broad shoulders of the Union?
Scotland is doing it without the broad shoulders of the Union. Scotland's earning X amount a year. 100% of the X amount is wheaked off to the Westminster Exchequer, and then we're getting a very small amount set back and told this is what you have to do for the next year. So even working under those budgetary circumstances, the Scottish Government have been able to, alongside obviously their ability to tax differently. I think Scotland has about 6 tax bands to England's 3.
Yeah. It's got a few more.
And so it's fairer taxation based on what you're earning. If you earn more, you will pay more tax. There aren't cuts just because you're a big business, and that also goes towards the budget. That they spend very wisely in Scotland in terms of mitigating Westminster effects. They mitigate a lot of the cost of living expenses that folk are being crippled by down south. You know.
If we look at some of the kind of, I guess this would be the key kind of economic argument, and there is some kind of pushback on it. I've seen from certain people. I'll hit the share screen on it so you can see what I'm looking at. So this is the thing we kind of discussed the other day. You know, they discuss this would be the broad shoulders of the Union right here. Is it running?
Yeah.
Can you see it? Okay, cool. So the argument of this, Scotland's government, I guess not running a budget surplus. This would be the broad shoulders of the Union here. And I think this is in the Scottish Government page, but I'm not sure if this is from
the Scottish Government, because of how the finances are set up by Westminster, aren't able to take on debt.
Yeah. So
they're not able to.
I guess the argument they would make is like it's the Westminster government covering it. They do factor in the North Sea oil revenue here, but the problem is all of this oil it's controlled by, I think it's the Crown, and the Crown have privatised it. It's gone to like BP and Shell and those sorts of companies, and so obviously it doesn't really allow the Scottish government to benefit from the oil like Norway has, because obviously Scotland could choose to privatise it, or which is more likely, they would kind of nationalise it via a company.
Scotland has such a Republican population that on the event of obtaining the full resumption of self-determination, of separating yourselves from Westminster control, I would think that it wouldn't be very long before we had a vote on whether we maintain the monarchy in Scotland, and that's not going to be a yes vote.
Sure.
People up here we don't care. I think it might have been a different case had all this happened prior to Liz dying. I think people had more of an emotional connection to her, the fact that she'd been queen for the majority, if not all, of their lives. Whereas they see Charles as just a bit feckin' dubious with his ties to your Jim'll fix it, and you've got Prince Andrew and the Epstein things, and there's just a lot of dubiousness around the present royal family.
Let's leave anything dodgy out of this one, because I can't stand that geezer. In getting rid of the crown, it would open up a lot of land to be the Scottish Government would likely enter negotiations with the Crown in reobtaining quite a lot of land, some of the resources, etc., that's under Crown purview. And I think that would be a good thing. I think that would also benefit Scotland and open up more finances to Scotland. If we regain self-determination, we have the opportunity to scrap the monarchy and scrap that funding. We've got 100% of our money suddenly to work with, and it's a government in Scotland
that's used to working on a really strict budget.
Yep.
So just the idea of what could be done with even double the amount that we get, much less 100% of it, would be crazy to see. It would be really interesting and exciting to see what kind of projects were kind of started. Again, in the oil thing, we could refine the oil, we could restart the steel industry, we could just inject money into having Scotland do for itself more than it does at the moment. Especially after the Thatcher cuts, to a lot of industry,
Yeah. With the 9% figure as well, that's been widely criticised by Richard Murphy, which I'll talk about in a sec. But it doesn't, like, countries running a deficit isn't that bad a thing. Like, it is higher than the rest of the UK, but, like, it's not that much.
How is that possible? How is it possible when we don't have the option to operate outside the budget we're given? How is it possible?
I guess it's done by revenue, I guess. It's how much Scotland brings in versus how much Scotland spends.
How is it possible when we are only given X amount and we can't spend more than that budget? There's no way. This is what people keep countering this deficit argument with, is you don't have an argument for a deficit in Scotland because we don't have the chance to,
In terms of, the criticism of it, this is an argument I had with someone. I did post this by Richard Murphy, and Murphy does criticise these numbers quite heavily. He doesn't offer his own numbers, and he says it's impossible to do so because of, like, he doesn't have. I don't think he's got the access to the data he would need. Bear with me one sec. Let me flicking around on the page a bit. But he goes, Jez does not account. Is not about the accounts of the Scottish government, nor is it about the account of the Westminster government in Scotland. There is no entity that exists in Scotland that embraces both these things. And he goes into a bit of detail here. But, effectively he argues that JERS doesn't make sense. The aim of JERS is to enhance public understanding of fiscal issues in Scotland. The primary objective is to estimate a public sector account for Scotland. But, he's arguing it doesn't work, basically. Yeah. And so that means the number of the 9% doesn't make sense either. Does that make sense?
So, on this subject, okay, so let's assume that Scotland has a huge deficit, right?
Yeah.
Let's assume that on ending the Union, not only are we going to be landed with, like, whatever debt we've accrued through whatever deficit, but let's suggest that even after ending the Treaty of Union, we're still responsible for half of England's debt as per the Treaty of Union, right? Let's just assume that for talking point's sake, okay? So Scotland leaves the Union with a bunch of debt saddled to it, right? There was a QC, Ian Hamilton, who I love just the bones of him. He's just the best guy. He was one of the guys that went down and liberated the Stone of Destiny, the Stone of Scone, when he was at uni. But he sits and he does this nice, beautifully succinct wee video called Who Owns Big Ben, right? So he's saying that, okay, so say Scotland leaves with huge debt, right? If we're taking on half of England's debt, we also take on half of their assets, right? The assets to which we've been signatory to, which would include Westminster. So if we own half the debt, we also own half of Westminster, right? Now, England actually can't afford to buy back our half of Westminster, right? It can't. It doesn't have the money to be able to afford that on its own. Which would mean that Scotland would then have the ability to sell our half to whatever interested party wanted it. China, Russia, Germany. Does any other government, are they interested?
I don't think Russia at the moment will the facility.
No, but you get what I'm saying.
There's a difference between debt and deficit. Obviously, Murphy kind of point out, like, the whole thing doesn't make sense in terms of the way assets are registered, like the money is registered in kind of southeast England.
Yeah.
Further to that, like, if you do manage to take back some of the royal sites, like they will most likely become UNESCO heritage sites. And I can tell you, UNESCO heritage sites are some of the best places you'll ever visit.
It would actually, in Scotland, it would be Heritage Scotland, or the National Trust for Scotland would likely take them over. But exactly under the same kind of idea.
And you'll pay like a certain amount. Mm-hmm. I think UNESCO heritage is just like a status they give. Like, it'll be under a different company or whatever, but it's kind of just a title that's given to certain areas.
Yeah.
Like Blenheim Palace, that was one that was really cool going there. The Prague Castle is really cool as well. So like there would be a lot of places where Scotland can do that too, and those are really good for tourism.
Oh, we've already got so many. I mean, we've been getting out and about to see as many of them as possible with the Ackies tours, you know. Like,
and what is hilarious is like it's not really talked about Scotland in terms of like for tourism. I think that's one of the things they can push, especially if they manage to get back some of the royal places, because those are really cool to be able to like actually walk into, not like stand outside at the gate like a loony.
Scottish culture and history is worth a lot of money on the world stage.
Yeah,
like, for sure. Because I mean that's off the back of Sir Walter Scott and Robert Burns, like really romanticising and promoting Scotland and its culture and heritage. You know, like
you also have a lot of the trade that Scotland does via Dover port. And I think those are registered as kind of more British exports rather than
English exports
to Scotland. Yes.
English exports. Yeah.
I think it'd be like the West. You know, the total they put in, like British.
Whereas outside of the Union, it just passing our border into England, that would be the point at which it left Scotland, and we would get a return for it.
Yeah.
Rather than it just is transported down to England, and at that point it leaves from an English port, the English border, and the return is brought into England in that case. The return would come to Scotland on it leaving Scotland.
It would be registered as like leaving, like as a Scottish export rather than anything else. And I think that's one of the other things he does talk about in kind of the articles he's published, which is it's just the metrics that are used for Scotland don't make sense. I think there was someone else saying like the amount of burden like that's registered as England buying doesn't make sense because it's a ridiculous amount. But obviously it goes via England to the other ports. It will go to Europe via England rather than, and be classed as a British export rather than a Scottish one, which does skew the numbers quite a lot.
It does, yeah.
So in terms of like, that's what I think he says when he talks about the metrics just being off. So how can you calculate a 9% deficit when you don't take that into account? And also the fact that Scotland can use the money from North Sea oil to build renewable energy, and that creates another revenue source.
Yeah, I mean, Scotland's already got the potential and renewable energy sector to a point where we can do for ourselves without having... We can fully power Scotland with what we've got in the go at the moment, and we've only really just started getting going with the renewable sector. So that has a lot of potential.
Yeah. And obviously you got the offshore wind, which you would get a lot of, but I think that 9% figure as well, that's a Brexit Scotland as well. That's a one that's left the EU.
Yeah. Which would not remain the case. Yeah. It wouldn't remain...
What would it look like inside the EU or inside EFTA? Yeah. What would that look like? Especially when the ports would have to get a lot bigger as well, because it'd be stuff coming into Scotland.
New trade routes would be negotiated and set up, especially I think with Scandinavia. I think a lot of new routes would be set up. But in terms of like oil, I mean that's what the Macron report was based on, was really to investigate how oil changed things in terms of the Scottish finances. And the result of the Macron report, which was a Westminster-backed report, it was a Westminster-backed investigation, it ultimately concluded that Scotland was embarrassingly wealthy when it comes to oil. And this was a report that came out in the 70s, that Scotland would do exceedingly well on the world stage should we to regain our self-determination, etc. But Westminster hushed up this report. So once it was concluded, they hid it. They didn't want it getting out because they were trying everything they could to stop talks of regaining the self-determination, and they felt like this was only going to serve to bolster a yes vote come an independence referendum in Scotland. So they hushed that up. They kept that under wraps a lot, you know. But they do that all the time in really stupid little ways, like Outlander, the series, that had to be pushed back. The premiere of the first season of Outlander had to be pushed back because they felt like it would have an effect on the referendum. They just keep doing this shit because they have a goal, and the goal is to keep Scotland and the finances and the resources tied up with Westminster and under quite a bit of Westminster authority, you know.
I think the economic argument is a lot weaker than it was, especially about 10 years ago. Like, I don't think it holds very well at all. Like, I think before you could make it a lot stronger, but going through over a decade of austerity and a lot of mismanagement and a union that is struggling, especially economically, I don't think that economic argument's as strong as it once was.
But then oil's not also as important as it once was either. I mean, what the Scottish Government should start focusing on is storage for the energy storage, because we're producing so much, and again, we've really just got started, but I don't believe we've got the capability to be able to store what we need to store to be able to then export energy to England or Ireland or Europe, or, you know.
I guess it'd be done via if they build those big cables. They can build like cables to transport it. Like, I think that's what France does.
I mean, it can be done. Like, definitely. Like, it's all possible.
I mean, they transport liquid gas from Qatar all the way to Germany. Like, it's pretty nuts, the stuff that they can do with exporting energy, especially nowadays. But yeah, I think we've kind of tackled the economic side of it. There is obviously the political side of it with it's very hard to make the political argument, I think, that Scotland could not be an independent country. Like, I know there's a quote from one person, we mentioned it before. Where is it gone? So there it is. Scots are not genetically programmed to make political decisions.
It was introduced under Westminster rules.
Yes, of course, but it could be introduced anywhere if people believed it was a good idea. We're not genetically programmed in Scotland to make political decisions.
This was the former leader of the Scottish Labour
Party,
Joanne Lamont.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the SNP have really debunked that quite aggressively. Like, in terms of spending, like you mentioned earlier, the highest spending, I think, on the healthcare in the Union. We also have the highest education spend as well. Followed by Northern Ireland, which is really weird. Northern Ireland's like second. I wouldn't have expected that. And then London third, but obviously the costs in London are a lot higher than they are in the rest of, like, everywhere. So that would make sense.
What's funny is that
the wages are higher in London.
What's the right wing, more than anything, that try to keep as much control, and things need to stay the same, you know. Like, they don't seem to be very progressive when it comes to the right wing. But quite a large talking point within right wing factions is the kind of libertarian argument that they want government out of the thing. They think that people should be able to do for themselves, that there should be less oversight, etc. That small governments are the way forward, etc. But they think that way because local legislation works, that if a faction is overseeing its own area, its own people, things are done better. Things are provided that may not have even occurred to a larger, further away administration. You know, local legislation almost always works better, especially when your services are publicly owned rather than privately owned. Because privately owned, again, means an entity that isn't there, that's not in with the people. It's an outside, external, possibly far away entity that doesn't give a as long as it's making money, which is what Westminster is to us. It's like a private company overseeing Scotland when our own people could just do it better, you know? Like,
Yeah, I mean, when you look at some of the results, the only thing that I think people did levy at Sturgeon was like the education results. But I think we went over this the other day as well. Like, this graph is a bit more deceiving than it looks, but it's fairly close. Like, it's not that different. I think, like, yeah, the UK overall is higher than Scotland is in certain areas, but most of it's within like a few points. And
but like, staying tied to England in the Union isn't going to affect how good or how bad education is in Scotland. But if we had more money to inject into education, possibly that would make a difference. But that can only be done with self-determination.
I guess the argument there is, like, Scotland does have power of education. Like, the Hollywood government does have power of education, and they haven't done a lot with it. But to be fair, how long have the SNP been in charge of Scotland? About, I think, was it 2010?
It's been a while.
Is it since 2010?
Since before I even got into politics. Yeah, I would say it's probably been about that long, yeah.
So yeah, you would hope to see better results, I guess, but like it's not.
But again, we might have control over education. We don't have control over the financing of these. We only have a certain budget to be able to split up between everything that needs funded. Whereas if we have full control of all of our budget, all of our money, all of our revenue, then maybe you'd see those numbers change because there'd be the money to actually enact change,
Yeah, probably would, but so Scotland does spend the highest per capita in terms of on education. But I guess we don't know if this stuff factors in things like private schools and stuff like that.
I mean, they've got their priorities right. Like when it comes to their budget, you can see for yourself, it's got the highest spending on education, on health, on they have their priorities right. They're not taking their money and putting it into track and trace that doesn't work, or PPE that doesn't work, or just spaffing billions off to kind of pals they need to keep sweet, And with the fact that they've budgeted with those priorities for so long, when we get a huge injection of our own money to be able to use, why would they not maintain the same priorities,
Yes, true. And I guess with Scotland having such good universities, you could produce a lot more teachers, and you could really push
better paid teachers,
No, let's not get ahead of ourselves. But yeah, I guess having more teachers will help take the workload off other ones as well. And maybe, just maybe, your education system, maybe the education system will produce people who think Scots can actually make political decisions, because evidently, I think the SNP, for the most part, have shown they can make political decisions.
Yeah.
Why this person made this dumb comment, I do not know.
Because they're Labour. No, I can tell you why. We've already discussed why. The pro-unionists in Scotland are not allowed to be pro-Scotland.
Yeah.
You have to believe that Westminster funds Scotland, that the union keeps Scotland afloat. You have to believe that to be a unionist in Scotland. There's no other. You don't get a different kind of unionist here. They all believe that, and you've got Paul Sweeney, I think he's a Labour guy. He came out recently as well saying Scotland is funded by London-generated wealth to the tune of 10 billion a year.
Scotland has benefited and continues to benefit. So, for example, from every year, Scotland has a net benefit of £10 billion of a fiscal transfer. That's equivalent of the entire NHS budget in Scotland. London essentially generates the wealth, and it's redistributed to other regions of the UK.
No, it's not. It's London generated in the way that the money came from Scotland, and then we got a little slice of it back. So London has generated it by taking it from us before going, okay, there's your portion. Okay. We're not funded by Westminster, we're funded by a pittance of our own money.
So I'm just trying to remember topics. So in terms of that, we've done the economic side of it, I think the whole argument of Scotland would run a deficit. I think England, most countries run a deficit anyways. It's about what you do with the money, and like you said, if Scotland borrows money to invest in, offshore wind, that generates a return rather than giving it to Dido Harding, which generated a return of more COVID. So, I guess it just depends on what your goals are at that point.
Yeah, like Scotland took on half of England's debt on the condition that the interest was to be paid off yearly at the very least, right? Westminster reneged on that immediately. The interest was never paid in full. It wasn't even half paid up until the end of the 19th century. So that national debt we see now comes off the back of that original debt that Westminster just decided to ignore. Like, it. What are they using our money for? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
all your home rulers at the end of the 19th century did the sums and found out to what extent Scotland was being robbed over a 60-year period from 1861 to 1891. I have a book for this because I want to get my numbers right, because the numbers are high. So it was worked out that in that period of time, Scotland had been overtaxed, and this is in comparison to England and Ireland in the Union. We had been overtaxed by £92,684,319. We had been underfunded, again using the same comparisons, by £39 million, which gave an aggregate loss over those 30 years of £131,684,319, which the Bank of England's inflation calculator has today equaling £13,768,988,187.44 that Scotland got robbed of for the last 30 years of the 19th century. And then we got oil in the latter half of the 20th century. Things did not get better for Scotland. There was a reason that they stopped publishing the reports annually in the papers as to how much the countries of the Union were giving to the Westminster Exchequer. Because it used to say, Scotland gives this much, Ireland gives this much, England gives this much. And they stopped publishing that at the start of the 20th century because it was becoming too embarrassing at how much more Scotland was paying annually than the other countries. Things haven't got better, you know.
Yeah, no, I can see that, and it's just at least you've done well with the resources been given, rather than I don't know how great it was under Labour, but based on conversations I've had with people, Scottish Labour did not do that good a job.
I loved Richard Leonard. He was my favourite Scottish Labour leader. Jim Fundley Mundley Murphy was one of the worst. Kezia Dugdale was kind of funny. I think her dad and her wife were SNP, so we'd get the odd tweets that were quite funny. But Richard Leonard was a gift to the Scottish Parliament. He would stand up at every First Minister's questions and say, Scottish Government needs to get on top of this thing that's failing. What have you to say about this? And Nicola would stand up every single time and go, that's not devolved to Scotland, that's reserved to Westminster. If you join us and help us get self-determination, we'll be able to tackle that and make that a bit better. But you need to join it.
Richard Leonard has talked about RBS and Airdrie Savings Banks, important institutions, but has it really escaped Richard Leonard's notice that just like regulation of employment and most of the macro powers over the economy, banking regulation is reserved to the United Kingdom Government? It is not a responsibility of the Scottish Government. Has it also escaped Richard Leonard's notice that the unemployment rate in Scotland right now is not just close to a record low, it's actually lower than it is in the rest of the UK?
Every single time. He was such a gift at outing the ways in which the Union was failing us. What
was his kind of response to that?
Oh, he would just look really embarrassed. He was red-faced a lot, you know. His own people would be back at Nicola Sturgeon as if she was talking. But we can't we can't do anything about what is a reserved issue. We have no control. Like we've been told under no certain terms by Westminster, you don't deal with this. We deal with this. So when one of their own is standing up going, this is failing, and the Scottish Government's like, that's not something that we can actually do anything about. Help us do something about it. They're like, nah.
I think that's some of the stuff they asked Sturgeon about around the COVID time, which was like, that's a devolved power. Like, I can't
all the time.
Again, I don't know where Richard Leonard has been for the last few weeks. I've been asking the UK Government to continue the furlough job retention scheme almost every day for weeks. So I'm glad that Richard Leonard has now decided to back that call. In addition to that, the Scottish Government has also set out plans for a youth jobs guarantee scheme, and we'll set out more detail of that in the coming days and weeks. But, you know, I have to say, Richard Leonard is capable of still surprising in this chamber, because I didn't think it would be him today that stood up to extol the virtues of Scotland being governed by a Conservative Westminster government. I thought that might come from the other side of the chamber. You know, the thing is, the furlough scheme is funded by the UK Government borrowing money. And the reason that they borrow that money and do it for us is because we don't have the powers here to do it ourselves. And what I would say to Richard Leonard is this: just use your imagination, right? And imagine Scotland was independent right now. He wouldn't have to be asking me to plead with a UK government to borrow more money to extend the job retention scheme. We could do it ourselves here in Scotland, like other independent countries the world over.
All the time. When it came down to borders and the stuff that every other country was taking under control, Scotland had no control over the practices that other countries were putting, the implementation other countries were putting in place to be able to protect their populations. Because of Westminster, Scotland wasn't able to do that for itself.
There was not a lot that Scotland could do. I think even Ireland was hampered by Northern Ireland, to be fair, in terms of
absolutely.
What they could actually do to deal with it, because you share a landmass and like an open border.
100%. And that's just another way in which the unions fail in Scotland, because we want a population. We want to add to our population. We want to attract people to come and live here and take up like employment and schooling, and we want people here. But Westminster's Tory constant rhetoric against immigrants, which makes a lot of people abroad go, why would we ever move to Britain to have to deal with all that racist?
Yeah.
You know, so we've got the veneer of racism that's been put on us by Westminster, but we've also got the anti-immigration like effects in legislature that stop us from being able to bring in the workers that we want and the population that would bolster Scotland.
Migration is absolutely essential to our public services, it's absolutely essential to our businesses, and it's absolutely essential to our economic growth. And what we need to do is end the demonisation of migration. In Scotland, we have a declining working age population despite a net number of people moving from the rest of the UK to Scotland. We need migrants. And this race to the bottom on migration, driven by Nigel Farage, followed by the Conservative Party, and hotly chased by the Labour Party, does not serve Scotland's interests. And it does not serve your interests either. So rise up against it. Do as Keir Starmer did in 2020 and talk about the benefits of migration, its importance to our fundamental aspects of life.
To be clear, any voter in Scotland who wants lower immigration should vote for other parties.
I think any voter in Scotland who wants to impact our economy, impact our NHS, should vote for the parties who want to cut migration, which is the Labour Party, the Conservative Party and Nigel Farage. And this is a consequence of us being led down the garden path by the right wing in British politics for far too long. We need to stand against it. We need to promote our economy, promote our public services, and to do so by promoting migration.
Okay.
So that would be something that would be tackled after self-determination. That would be something that would be focused on, would be building houses and obtaining a population for Scotland from elsewhere, you know.
it's kind of the needs of England being put first, because obviously England has the most amount of MPs, so it has the most say over things.
It's always been the case. That's how this conversation started. It's always been the case.
When you've got a bunch of clowns in charge like we do now and a bunch of clowns in opposition, it's not going to change a lot.
Representation means everything. Representation means absolutely everything at Westminster. If we had better representation, maybe we wouldn't have been as overtaxed as we have been. Maybe we wouldn't have been underfunded as we have been. There was a period in Westminster where they were talking about funding the universities throughout the UK. Ireland got funding to the tune, I think it was about 2,000 per university. No, it was more than that. I think they got about 10,000 per university. England got the same or more, and Scotland had applied for its universities to also get grants at the same time. The Scottish application kept getting bit by the way, and then one of the speakers in the House of Commons went, "We don't feel like you've put this in time, so we could give you 2,000 per university, but honestly we're not even going to do that." So Scots were left going, "Well, give us the 2,000 at least for a university," and they ended up actually not getting anything when Ireland and England got all their universities funded.
This would have been pre-Irish independence, I'm guessing.
Yeah, this is about 1857.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was the speaker an ancestor of Lindsay Hoyle, do you think?
No, I don't know. He's a fud though, isn't he? Like, bring back your man before. We liked the man before. Yeah. Like, he didn't take the Tory like.
Bring him back.
Bring him back.
Yeah. What would you say then to the discuss the political side of it? I guess with Scotland having a lot less representation, and it's just kind of it is England dominated. To be honest, what would you make to the comparisons of Brexit and Scottish independence, given what we've talked about?
Well, people are seeing the effects of Brexit. I mean, you can go probably not even 5 streets in Glasgow and you're going to come across another building that's got EU funded, like, plaques on them, you know. Mm-hmm. Projects all over the place that were EU funded. Brexit was so detrimental because the European Union was so beneficial. Not only were we represented to a greater extent than many of the countries within the European Union, we were one of the top 5 in the EU. We had a proper place at the table. We could make changes and have a voice that was heard within the European Union. We got so much funding for so many things. There was the free travel and free trade, which just made life so easy when it came to working or schooling or just travelling and seeing a bit of the world. Life was sunnier in the European Union because it held so many benefits for us. And the fact that we have lost those benefits is what's making Brexit so detrimental and so obviously detrimental, because we're starting to reap what Westminster have sown. We're starting to see the fact that we can't afford to do as many of this, especially in terms of science projects. We're not involved in the same scale as we had been.
Horizon, yeah.
We're not involved in the same way as we had been, and Scottish self-determination is off the back of the fact that the British Union has proved itself to only be detrimental to Scotland. That whenever we have tried to make it equal, whenever we have tried to have a voice within the union or a seat at the table, we've been just knocked back, ignored, deaf ears turned to us. We've been laughed out of Parliament. I think, was it Angus Robertson stood up and said the majority of Scots feel like Scotland's oil should be under Scotland's control. And David Cameron stood up, waited for the laughter to finish before saying, "Ask a stupid question," and then the laughter continued.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. A poll last week showed that 68% of Scots want oil revenues devolved to Scotland. Does the Prime Minister agree with 68% of Scots, or does he not?
Well, if you ask a stupid question, you get a stupid answer.
We're not taken seriously. We've never been taken seriously by the British Union. We've always just been something that England has taken control of, and they'll make use of us however they want to make use of us, you know. And whenever we can be of use to them, they'll make sure that we're going to bloody be there, you know. If they want water piped down from Scotland, they're going to get water piped down from Scotland. Is there going to be cost to Westminster? No, we're a union, you know.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I really don't get the argument that you can compare the two anyways. Like, the whole Brexit argument was based in sovereignty, which didn't exist. Scottish independence actually gives Scotland sovereignty. So I don't really get it. I mean, if they're going to argue about the economic damage independence Scotland would do, like we've covered that. Like, there's no way you could even measure that. Not really. Given the fact that the only metric we have is deeply flawed, and there's a lot of stuff that's not been taken into account in terms of ways Scotland can generate revenue.
Oh God, yeah.
So again, that doesn't make sense.
And even not being in, like, even not having the exact numbers to hand, the fact is we only get a small cut of what we give to the Westminster coffers. So if we were to suddenly have 100% of our revenue, how could that be more detrimental to Scotland? How could we be poorer as a result of that? It doesn't make sense. The sums don't make sense. Even not knowing the number we're starting off with, we're seeing what we can do with the small amount we get back from Westminster. So even getting half of what we send to Westminster is going to be better. So surely getting 100% to ourselves is just positive. There's no downsides to that, you know? Yeah. You can't say you're going to be worse off because of that. It's not possible, you know?
I think with the border question as well, like, you still have, like, you can have a system like the Common Travel Area, which Ireland has with the UK. Like, so I don't think immigration, like, in terms of travel, would be a big problem.
No.
Trade would be a question mark depending on how strong the Scottish ports are. But again, like,
that can all be bolstered after the fact.
Yeah. Is either side going to really, like, try and impact the other side's trade with the other that much, given, like, England's food security is really bad, to the point where we're having to change our import checks because of Brexit. Like,
it was trade fights that got us roped into the Union in the first place.
Yeah.
I mean, it was England's Alien Act was literally put in place despite the fact it was costing the English Parliament so much money to police it. They were spending hand over fist in a bid to try and police these Scottish foreigners that were on English soil because of their own Alien Act. You know, like, it was crazy. Like, they had to, goods from Scotland or from England into Scotland were stopped. So they had to police that, you know, because there wasn't to be trade between the two countries, you know?
That's crazy, you know, a country putting their economic interests because of political reasons.
Purely because they didn't want Scotland being able to have the trade that they did. That was why, like, they scuppered Darien. That's why they got the king involved in scuppering Darien, was because they couldn't, the idea of Scots being able to trade as effectively as the English were, they couldn't get their head around that. They didn't want to see that, you know. So English jealousy led to the Alien Act, which led to them having to spend so much. They would literally shoot themselves in the foot just to enact against Scotland. And this is the faction we got into union with. And it's been the same since. It's the same faction. It's descendants of the same faction that seem to be operating the same kind of policies. So I believe that should we get self-determination, I think there is going to be a period of unstable relations between the two countries until things settle. Like, I think there is going to be a period where everything's a bit kind of shaky, a wee bit, like, and everyone's going to have to be very diplomatic for a wee while. But that will settle down, you know.
I think that's normal. That's normal after any country kind of leaves like a union or like gets independence. Like, it's always pretty like weird at first.
I think the hope is from every time the British have lost a colony, I think there's been the hope that they were going to see that country fail as a result. I think there was the expectation, because I think that the Westminster folk believe their own gumph. I think that they believe that Scotland is only able to exist because of the broad shoulders of the Union.
Yeah.
I think that they believe that, despite the fact that it's a lie that has been touted in a bid to keep Scots on side with the Union and to maintain unionism within Scotland. It's also having the opposite effect in England, because the English are hearing the same lie, but the English are saying, why are we funding them having free prescriptions? Why are we funding them having baby boxes? Why are we funding free education, free university education? Why are we funding this? Can we not just get rid of them? And I'm in the belief that lie alone, if the referendum for Scottish self-determination was to be taken Britain-wide, I think we would see a yes vote off the back of the English looking to get shot of the people that are apparently costing them anything, you know?
I think that would be a bit ropey. I'm not sure.
I don't know. I think it would be interesting, to be honest.
I think it would be. I'd be interested to see it. But I think it goes back to, you know, the old argument of the white man's burden. Like, you know, like, these countries can't run themselves, therefore we have to run it. But like, like you said, like, if it's true Scotland's a financial burden, why don't you just let it go?
I mean, see, the EDL are not so far removed from Farage's UKIP lot, or not so far removed from the Tories, and they really aren't fans of Scotland. Like, they think that we're like kind of annoying wee upstarts, that every time we've gone to Parliament to ask for something, that even something that England already has in place, they're like, look at them, they're asking for again. These people.
I think it's the idea of, well, why can't we don't have these things? Why should you have them, or why are we paying you to have these things? Like, it's what they use against like people who might immigrate here, or people who seek asylum here. It's like, oh, I can't have this. You should have nothing.
Yeah. How dare you?
And it's kind of and it's kind of they put that on Scotland. Like, I did listen to like a conversation between Rory Stewart and Caroline Lucas about it.
It sounds as though you are quite pro-Scottish independence. I mean, the way in which you've characterised what I, as a unionist, would characterise as, we had a referendum very recently, people voted to stay. There isn't evidence that there's an overwhelming majority for independence, and we're not going to have another referendum in another generation, would be the normal position for me and many people in the Labour Party who are trying to keep the United Kingdom together. You almost talk as though you're sort of slightly looking forward to a day when Scotland achieves its independence. I mean, even that language it hints to me that you're somebody who actually isn't very comfortable with the idea of the United Kingdom.
No, I don't think that's true, although you rightly take me up on that verb, which I shall consider. But what I do think is that it should be up to Scotland. I think Scotland should decide whether or not it wants to remain part of the UK. Scotland
did decide,
yes,
Caroline, and we decided we'd do it once in a generation. I mean, otherwise you end up in the Canadian situation where you have a referendum every 3-4 years whenever the SNP wants to have a political event.
But work that out within Scotland. Don't come running to a government in Westminster to say whether or not you can do that. If there isn't a support for that within Scotland, then I'm sure that the party who is proposing that won't do so well and won't have the right and the power to introduce it. But what I'm objecting to is one component part of the United Kingdom having a veto on whether another component part has the right to have a referendum on whether or not to leave.
But this isn't abnormal, right? This is what Spain would do with Catalonia. This is what the United States would do with Texas. I mean, nations are complicated things, and we went through this with Canada and Quebec. It's not a simple question of here's a component part of the country, and it can continually create this deeply destabilizing moves again and again, and also that the rest of the country doesn't have a say. I mean, I don't think it is only for Scotland, the question of Scottish independence. I think that's one of the things that makes the United Kingdom different. And this is where I think this question of stories becomes quite complicated, and where I think Alistair's right to say you defining England as separate from Scotland is problematic, because I would argue that actually the rest of the country does have some sort of interest in the question of how nations relate to each other. It isn't purely for Scotland.
I guess I would just say that I think the relationship between Texas and Washington is not the same as it is between the four nations that make up the United Kingdom. That Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland have greater rights and greater self-determination than a state within the United States.
And like the arguments Rory Stewart used that I can't really separate England and Scotland like that. I'm like, bro, what are you talking about? Like, what is it kind of? It's that old. I think it is partly. They won't call it anymore, but it's the old white man's burden mentality. Even though Scotland is obviously, people are white there. It's kind of like the idea of they can't look after themselves. It's our responsibility to look after them. When it's like it's dumb. Like that didn't work for the colonies. It doesn't work for any other country. Like you can't govern like that. It's very patronising. I'd say
we didn't have to be a different colour. A good proportion of the population up to the Union spoke Gaelic, and that was enough to make them of no use to England. In 1616, you had the Education Act for Scotland, and that was to put schools in every parish. But the point of that wasn't to make sure the kids were educated. I mean, it did that, and cheers for that. But it was purely just to make sure that they could speak English. They had to be able to read the Bible in English before they were allowed to go. And then in 1696, that act was enforced, and it wasn't just that they had to read the Bible, they had to be conversational in English, because what they were realising was the kids could learn how to say the words that they were reading. It didn't necessarily mean that they understood the words that they were saying. So they had to be conversational in English at that point. And you had people come out with like the statutes out of Iona and things, the kind of idea that once a kid could speak enough English, they would be sent down to the lowlands or the north of England to finish their schooling. And that was in an attempt to anglicise the Gaelic population of Scotland, because the kids would then go back to their family having experienced a different way of life and culture, speaking a different language, and the parents would then have to catch up with their wains just to be able to interact with their own children. That was the UK's centralising tactic before the Union even got going.
You see that with other countries, like Russification was one where they try and get rid of other languages. Yeah, the
Native Americans in Canada and the US as well, they experienced exactly the same thing.
Oh, fuck no, that's a different conversation. That's a really
it's
dark
it's
topic.
all the same tactics that are used.
Yeah, that stuff is really dark. Some of the stuff that happened over there.
Yeah, same in Ireland.
Yeah, true. Kind of the importance of self-determination. Would you say for a country to be able to decide its own fate, or I guess a people to be able to decide their own fate, what would you say is the importance of that?
I mean, it means everything, doesn't it? Like, being able to do for yourself, not having to rely on someone telling you what you can or can't do, what you can or can't spend. I mean, in any other situation, that would be classed as an abusive relationship.
That's true, yeah. And why do you think unionists don't get? Why do you think unionists keep arguing for the union of the importance of it? What do you think that is? Like in terms of, it's not just like an economic or a political thing. It's like like an identity thing almost.
Yeah, it's an emotional argument. They have to go to emotional arguments when it comes to unionism in Scotland, because there aren't any good arguments for unionism in Scotland, because the union is so detrimental to Scotland. The problem with the unionists is that while the SNP and the Scottish Government are doing really good things in terms of mitigating the worst of the effects from Westminster, you know, the cost of living and everything, by being able to give us free prescriptions, all the things we've talked about previously. The unionists are living in a country where they're getting these mitigating tactics all over the place. Like, as part of daily life, they're experiencing these mitigating tactics, but they're not seeing it as that. From their side, all it's doing is lessening the harmful impacts of the union, so that the unionists are almost unable to see some of the worst impacts of the union because they're not having to experience them because of the Scottish Government. But I would be interested in what would happen if Westminster was just to go, do you know what? We're done with Scotland trying to get what it wants out of this. We're done with them like trying to legislate for themselves. We've seen what they're trying to do with the hate crime bill, or the whole trans kind of bill, and they're like, no, f*** it, we're going to take back legislation, we're going to scrap devolution, we're just taking Scotland back under our wing again, like, years have lost your parliament, like, if we were suddenly to have to live by what people in England are experiencing, and the costs and expenses and the privatisation that the English experience, I think the unionists in Scotland would be harder pushed to be able to even have that emotional argument for the union. Because at the moment, they're like, the union's not that bad. You know, in what ways is it hurting us? We get all this free prescription and baby box and free education. It's like, that's not the union that's doing that for you. It's the Scottish Government that's doing that for you. But they see it as the union has allowed the Scottish Government to do that for us. That we only have the... I mean, I was brought up as a Tory unionist, and I was that way until 2013, when I decided to educate myself, because I'm like, well, I know how I'm going to vote. I know how I've been brought up to think. I was told for my whole life that Scotland would become a developing nation were we to separate from the union. We wouldn't be able to afford anything. We would suddenly become the non-PC term of a third world country, was how I was told it.
Global South, you know.
Growing up.
Oh, right. No, I see what you're saying.
But that's that whole Westminster subsidises Scotland lie that keeps the unionists on board. That's a lie that kept my family and me on board. I thought that Scotland would be in dire straits without Westminster to fund us, until I actually started looking into it and went, it doesn't at all fund us. If anything, we could fund ourselves better than Westminster allows. You know, like, we have far more resources to make use of. And it wasn't even political research that got me to change my mind. All I did was read some history books about Scotland and actually just learn about my country a wee bit. And that's what changed my mind. To know something is to begin to love it and to want the best for it. And that's what learning Scottish history did for me. And that's why Random Scottish History began, because I thought, if people have access to the same information as I'm coming across and I'm able to purchase for myself, if I'm able to put these out of print publications online to make them searchable and available to anyone that's interested, maybe other people will get to like their country, because the unionists in this country don't like their country. You can't be a unionist and be pro-Scotland anymore. That's not how it works. You have to believe that Scotland can't do for itself to be able to maintain a unionist aspect in Scotland. Because the moment you realise that it can do for itself, far better without the purse strings being held by Westminster, your argument's gone. You know, like
I was more thinking about, English unionists, the ones that are like down here who they also seem really attached to you. Okay, the Scottish one I can get if you believe like Westminster's funding the show.
Yeah.
What do you think about? Why do you think English unionists are so attached to the union and don't want to see Scotland go?
I just think that they see Scotland as being under the thumb, and when you've got. So the Gender Recognition Act is a really good example.
The reason why the government can't tell us exactly what the conflict is with the Equality Act is because there isn't one.
Yeah.
The Scottish Gender Recognition Reform Bill does not affect the operation of the Equality Act, and everyone in this House knows that full well because Labour MSP Pam Duncan Glancy put it on the face of the bill with their amendment. So will the Minister admit what this Section 35 order is really about, and that is fanning the flames of a culture war that is harming trans people across the UK?
Whenever Westminster has a chance to knock Scotland back at all, or reject policies that Scotland want to enact in any sense, that's Westminster putting Scotland under the boots, under the thumb. And I think the English unionists are like, well, of course we're keeping Scotland. Like, why would we not keep Scotland? They see it as a region of England. They just see it as a greater England rather than a Great Britain. You know, I genuinely think they see that the English border goes around the entire island. I don't think that they see Scotland as being a country at all. And I've spoken to plenty of English unionists that do not see Scotland as anything other than a larger Yorkshire. You know, I just think that they believe they own Scotland. They can do what they want with Scotland, and it's not for the Scots to do anything about it. You know.
Okay. In terms of, there was one question actually I just thought about just when you were talking about like Scottish unionists. Is do you think if Labour somehow did win the elections in Holyrood, right? Do you think they would roll back a lot of the protections the SNP have put in place, like the bedroom tax? What should I think of those?
Again, I think
free
those
prescriptions, that kind of stuff.
I can't imagine that they're blind to the fact that the mitigations are what's still keeping quite a lot of unionists on side. I think they would probably campaign, as they always have done, as being the opposite of the SNP, as not being on board with SNP policies in any way. But I think if they took over, they wouldn't actually make any changes, not any huge changes to that.
Because you would think it'd create a rift there, wouldn't it? Like if you've got free prescriptions in say a Labour-run Holyrood, right?
Yeah.
And you don't have free prescriptions in a Westminster-run England, right?
Yeah.
You would think people would be like, what the hell? Like, why do they, do you know what I mean? Like, people are like, why should they get, cheaper universities and free prescriptions and have more nationalised rail and a baby box and things like that when we're run by, effectively, almost the same party, we'll say, the Labour Party in both.
I'm not sure I'm going to word this how I want to. It's important to both Labour and the Tories in Scotland to make it seem as if the SNP-led government is failing, okay? To the point that they will team up across councils in Scotland. So your two main opposition parties at Westminster are firmly in bed together up in Scotland in councils. They team up, they form coalitions in our councils in order to give them greater numbers than the elected SNP councillors, so that they're able to veto whatever the SNP council wants to do for whatever area. And that was made really evident recently from East Renfrewshire, where the SNP councillor that was voted in there came out and told people how it had gone this meeting. They had been granted X amount of money by the Scottish Government for varying projects for their region, and the Tory and Labour factions teamed up to nix a bunch of those projects, and not just nix a bunch of those projects, cost cut some of those, literally strip funding from some of the projects. And the SNP councillors outside telling us about it, going, we have the money to pay for this, this, this and this, but not only have we been stopped from spending the money on this, this, this and this, they're actually planning on making cuts to this and this and this.
I've just came out of the council meeting after we've set the budget for the forthcoming year, and I can't believe what I've just seen happen. Tories and Labour have just voted together for higher council tax for all residents. They have voted to cut our school library service in all of our schools. They are cutting our school technician service. They are cutting our adult learning service. They're refusing to invest £100,000, which was in our budget, for children with additional support needs. They are cutting our roads budget, something that we had taken out, but they have put back in. They are cutting our customer first service. They voted together on all of these, and there's more. They are increasing burial charges. They are imposing cuts to our vital community learning and development. They are cutting education ICT technicians. They are cutting ICT staff reductions. They're also cutting strategic services, more staff reductions, even though they insisted there would be no compulsory redundancies. The amount of jobs that they have just cut in there is quite astonishing. And actually really, really sad to see it. I've just had to sit through it and watch them all vote together on this. Our budget saved all these. They are cuts to the bilingual support service in our schools for our pupils as well. So basically, Labour and Tories have voted together for higher council tax and less vital services for every single one of our residents. And quite frankly, I'm absolutely disgusted that I've just sat in there and watched that. So yes, as I said, they have just voted to impose cuts on our school library services and against that £100,000 that we wanted to give to additional support needs children. So I'm going back into the meeting now, but once again, Labour and the Tories have voted together.
Because if they make cuts after the SNP's been voted in, despite the fact that it's been a coalition of the Labour and Tory party that are making the decisions effectively, the people on the ground might go, oh, we voted the SNP in, and look, nothing's getting funded, and this is getting cut, and this group that's been really useful to folk is no longer even on the go because they can't afford to be on the go anymore. The Labour and the Tory party will literally team up to make their areas worse, with the view of trying to make it look as if it's worse because the SNP got voted in, when it's not the case.
Yeah, no, I hear that.
Do you know what I mean? So that in itself keeps unionists on board, because it keeps people like the people that aren't willing to look into a thing against the SNP. You know, like,
yeah, it's kind of deranged. That is like just teaming up to square with the council.
What councillor doesn't accept money to be spent within their region? They literally just went, no, we don't need it, and in fact, not only don't we need it, we're making cuts.
Yeah, they're kind of.
But this is the same reason that Labour and Tories aren't getting voted in Scotland, because the people that are paying attention know that they're doing this, so they're not going to get voted in. It's also the fact that the Labour and Tory party do not speak for Scots, neither at Holyrood nor in Westminster, and especially not at Westminster. They're there to laugh and deride at the SNP. They're not there for any other reason. You know,
I think, yeah, if we go on to a final question, what would you like to see an independent Scotland look like? The top 5 things. Like, what would you want to see for Scotland's future if it gained independence?
Okay, so we would have to rejoin the EU, to begin with. So join the EU, and maybe like another union, like if another union was also going to add benefit to us, but certainly the EU.
Right.
But we would think we'd be open to joining EFTA, etc., like other versions, you know, because union is good, and this is why Scots prior to the World Wars were pro-union and like Scotland, was because they knew unions were typically good things, because unions made everyone equal. Unions were to the benefit of all, you know.
With Scotland as well, like, I think the population sizes would be more similar to Norway rather than...
Yeah, so EFTA wouldn't be an issue for Scotland. Like, it would be an issue for England, and not an issue for Scotland to join.
Yeah, because it's similar to more of the Nordic countries.
Yeah, so we'd get that over and done with. In doing that, once again, we're going to have the benefits of the European Union, the single market, travel, trade, all of that. So we're also going to see an influx of population off the back of that, the same as Ireland saw, like on the advent of Brexit. So we would
you deal with your housing crisis better when it happens.
So we would have a rise in population. We would also be able to encourage people to come to Scotland. So there'd be immigration off the back of just Scots wanting people to come and join us here. So I would want to see housing projects invested in hugely. I would want to see like a really good substantial rise in housing. I would want to see infrastructure focused on...
So housing 2, infrastructure 3, okay.
Yeah. Infrastructure would have to be focused on. I'm not just talking about bridges and roads. I'm talking about for the oil industry, for power, for energy storage. Again, like your steel industries and shipbuilding, etc. All that could be invested in and reignited.
You're talking big infrastructure. We're talking
like big national
energy,
projects, you know.
Transport.
Get all that fire lit under all of them, you know, and then everything would just fall into place, I would think, because the people, there'd be more employment with those sectors reignited and reinstituted. You would, so people would just have a better life. They would have a better work-life balance as well. There could be policies enacted in order to kind of give people that better work-life balance, maybe give people 4-day work weeks or whatever, you know, like they've trialled in other places.
I said hopes, not a utopia. This is not... I said hopes for the future, not...
These are my hopes. These are all feasible.
4-day work week is,
There's also... is it UBI?
Universal Basic Income. That's 4. I think that'll be the 4th one, yes.
Because that was something that the Scottish Government were already wanting to trial. I think, like, in some of the cities, Glasgow, Dundee, Aberdeen, I think they were looking to trial some kind of universal basic income. So I think that would be something that they'd already be on board with implementing.
Wales. I think they've trialled it in Wales, in some parts of Wales, I think. There have been trials going on, yeah.
So that's also... Everything suddenly becomes possible on the advent of Scottish self-determination. Do you know what I mean? Not just like... See, if you tackle the big things, you find that the small things just fall into place.
Sure.
Do you know what I mean?
You've got one more. Is there any more, a 5th one you'd want?
I would want us to be able to be friends with Westminster. I would want us to be able to be not just diplomatic with each other. I would want us to be able to work together with Westminster on whatever might affect the island as a whole, in terms of, say, global warming and environmental issues. I would want us to be able to work together on these kind of things as well. I wouldn't want there to be any kind of resentment or lasting animosity, like, after the fact, because there would be no need for that, you know, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Those are good 5, I'd say. And if people have more suggestions, they can put that in the comments. I would go for, there's that American politician who said a chicken in every oven. Would you run with a policy of a fried Mars bar in every basket? Would that be popular? Because that's one of the key things I love about Scottish cuisine is you don't eat fried Mars bars.
Sure.
You guys tried running on that?
I can't recommend a deep fried bar, not unless it's a tempura batter. I have done it once in my own deep fryer tempura batter. Like a Mars bar, chop it up into little bite-sized pieces and put it in tempura batter. It's lovely. It's all light and fluffy and melty. It's lovely.
I might have to try it at some point. I tried it once. It wasn't great. My brother liked it.
Not your chip shop batter. I really recommend a nice light tempura batter.
There you go. A fried Mars bar in every basket.
Sure.
That's good enough for people.
Yeah.
But yeah. I think that's a good point to wrap up. I think it's been good conversation. I think
I've enjoyed it a lot. I hardly even had to refer to my notes at all.
Is that a good thing? I don't know.
I think it's a good thing.
Probably, yeah. I think we've gone through kind of Scotland joining. I think it's like the beginning to where we are now, I guess. Like where Scotland started, like the process of joining the Union to where we are now, which is Scotland still looking to leave the Union, but kind of momentum stifled.
The whole seeking to leave the Union is a really new thing. I mean, after it failed, like in 1713, we were just resigned to it, and then we became proponents of it, and all the Scots did from then on was just try to get what we were owed and an equal share of everything. The desire to actually end the Union, that only really got going in the 60s, and it's obviously been a slow burn since we're 60 years on.
I think the final point worth addressing is kind of Holyrood was designed to keep majority independent parties out. That's why there's a coalition between the SNP and the Greens, right?
Yeah.
And then the final point is, despite what Holyrood is trying to do, they can't actually trigger a referendum. Like, that goes through Westminster. That's what the court's decided as well.
Yeah, we have to be given the authority to hold, or we have to be given the right to hold a referendum. The Scottish Government hasn't the ability to do that on its own. As a branch office, it really doesn't have any powers to go against Westminster at all.
Can't you trigger Article 50?
I'm not up with contemporary possibilities that the Scottish Government are.
It's the one that we triggered to come out of the EU. I think it's Article 50. Yeah, it was the one. Is the one that.
Is it not like it's an Section 30 we need? We're needed because Salmon was able to get a Section 30. He was too confident. He was just like, let's have a referendum. Let's do it. Despite the fact that we might be leaving the Union, like the European Union, in a couple of years. F it, let's see how it goes.
Yeah, I think hindsight's really good for that one, because had it happened after the Brexit referendum, I think it would have been very difficult. If it happened now, I think it would have been very difficult to convince anyone that the Union is functional.
We also wouldn't have that once in a generation bullshit. Repeated.
What's his name, man? Austerity boy, Rory Stewart Bush. He said, we all agreed it was a once in a generation.
No one agreed that.
No one said that. Alex Salmon said that, sure.
Yeah.
But that's one dude.
Yeah. No one ratified that. No one made a contract of that.
It's not in. It's not in the legislation. Once in a generation is not. And that's once every. It's ironic. The guy who's trying to get us back into the EU on the back of a quote once in a generation EU Brexit referendum. Is saying no, Scots have to wait. But for Brexit, no, we're not going to wait.
Your unionists are seeing the European Union as being akin to the British. They're just seeing union good. Yeah. So we want to go back into EU. Why would Scotland want to leave the Union? Union good. They want to get back into the EU. So why would they want to leave the British Union? It's like because one's beneficial, one's detrimental, pal. Have a look at it. Just
a bit like the European Union.
A bit like the European Union, not very much like the British Union though, which is what makes us leaving the British Union very different from Brexit scenario and why we went into the EU again, because at least that union was beneficial, as we've seen.
And you could choose to leave when you wanted, which you can't do otherwise.
There's more democracy, you might say. Just have a look.
You know, there's a veto. Like countries that are hungry, like all countries have a veto. So
I've got
you have to take them seriously on certain votes.
I've got like 4
regardless of how
books.
small they are.
I've got 4 books published by myself that will tell whoever wants to know it how the union has gone for us. If they want to compare that information and those detrimental effects to what the EU offered, by all means do it. You'll see why Scotland wants to rejoin the EU and leave the British Union. You know, like
I'd be interested in seeing more conversations between Scottish independents and unionists, because I don't get what the union arguments are. I've not heard them really make it that well. So
because there aren't any good arguments. It's all emotional arguments. It's all like, oh no, but our friends and family and colleagues are in England, and why would we want to separate? Why would we want to? We're not going anywhere. We're literally landlocked together on an island.
You're leaving the landmass. You're gonna blow up the border.
Yeah. We're just going to sail off. It's like we're still going to be the same distance away from our family, colleagues, and friends. There's not actually going to be a difference in that, you know. Like
you're going to sail off and get a border with Norway.
Yeah, we're not suddenly going to become enemies. Well, my hope is that at least those in authority aren't going to be super super angsty with each other. Or, you know.
What's crazy is I got through this whole thing without making a groundskeeper Willie reference.
The most recent polling shows that we are split 50-50 on the matter, and I am hesitant to throw my support to either side, be it the right one or the obviously wrong one. Also, I would like to say a few things to those who are sceptical of Scottish independence. Scotland is the home to 2/3 of Europe's oil reserves. Notice how in no country rich in oil do the men wear pants. We also make a fine damn whiskey, and we spell whiskey right too. Gah! That's not a tattoo, it's a birthmark!
We love groundskeeper Willie.
Yeah, he's funny. I like it.
He made a solid case for independence back in 2014.
He did.
You know?
He did. Yeah, he said Scottish independence, which was very, very surprising. He would make such an intervention. But,
Love
what
it.
he was talking about. The Owen Jones video I put out, people were just having an absolute meltdown about what he said, and I'm just like, guys, like, what he said wasn't that bad.
No.
Like,
Super Tansky went on a big rant about him as well. Like,
don't start.
I know. Like, I know.
Don't start.
I do watch her though. She's like one of my only sources of information when it comes to English politics at the moment.
Sources, please.
I don't know that I want to. Like,
but no, I don't really get what their arguments are, to be honest, about what he said. Like, they criticise Labour, but when Jones does it, it's bad. So okay.
it's because you've got to be. You can't say bad things. We need them in government, don't you know? You're not allowed to say bad things. Don't say anything that's going to stop people from voting for them, because we need the Tories replaced. You know,
they've literally said like Labour should stop praising Thatcher, and she got real mad about it, and so did Graham Hughes. And it's like, okay, so are you allowed to criticise Labour or not? Like, I need to know which one is it. Or is it
you have to be able to.
Allowed to criticise them?
I
don't get it.
Even like SNP adherents aren't shy at like outing them when it's like, that was a really fucking stupid thing you just did. Do you know what I mean? Like, and the SNP in itself, I think, have in a few occasions been quite open and honest about failings, and people have resigned quite happily just off the back. So, you know, we're not like the Tories where like we just try and hold on to every day, just, you know, to save face. Do you know what I mean? I think we are like quite happy to have the SNP kind of answerable to us to a certain extent, you know.
Yeah, I just find it hilarious how Labour are praising Thatcher despite Thatcher being hated, especially in Scotland.
Tony Blair, like, he was very open about the fact he was furthering Thatcher policies. And again, you guys are seeing them as totally opposite things down in Westminster. Up here, they are the same entity. They are one and the same. They act together. They share the same policies. They share the same goals. They've very much in bed together up here.
I think it depends who you ask and how close the two parties are. To be honest with you, so it depends. It depends who you ask. And right now, given the fact that they have the same fiscal rules, it's very hard to argue that they're different. To be honest,
they're not different. And I mean, I consider it foreign politics, Westminster, but I was shocked that it was Labour that brought up austerity. I was like, what the f***? Seriously? Like, you couldn't just wait 5 minutes for the Tories to introduce it? No? Like, okay. Austerity's such a Tory thing, do you know what I mean? It's...
Yeah.
And yet it was Labour this time around that just went, no, we're going to need to, because it worked so well the last time around.
Oh, you're talking about maxing out the credit cards and all of this stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's it's kind of funny because people keep arguing that Labour aren't pro-austerity. It's like they're using the same arguments and they're using the same fiscal rule.
Yeah.
And they're saying they're not going to increase taxation.
They're literally saying it out loud. They're telling you what they're going to do.
Yeah, but...
And yet they're still going to get voted in because they're not the Tories.
As a wise man once said, it's just the smokescreen.
Yeah.
It's not an issue.
People need to stop listening to the words and seeing the actions, I think. They need to...
Well, people keep arguing, well, you have to wait for them to get into power before you see their actions. And it's like, I'm not going to give them the chance to do anything dumb.
I think people are going to be really sad. I think people are going to realise really quickly that they might have got rid of the Tories, but things aren't getting better quickly under Labour.
I don't know. I hope they change things. Like, I really hope that this is just a smokescreen, but I'm not seeing it. Maybe I'm stuck in the smoke. I don't know. But we'll cut the video here, I think.
Okay.
Right. Thanks for coming on the channel.
You're very welcome, darling. It was good fun.
Yeah.